Hi, in this video we're going to continue working on our thick liquid SSS material. This is where we left on the last lesson. You can just open 13 begin. And I'm kind of happy with the way our SSS base is looking like. We could always increase a little bit the samples on the specular, but I'm not going to worry much about that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new material, a Vero material. I'm going to call this chocolate crumbs maybe, or I just want to recreate a tiny bit parts of chocolate that didn't melt all the way through. I'm gonna go ahead and give it a dark color, something like the chocolate, but maybe not as dark, so something like this. Give it some saturation, bring it down, maybe not as much as the chocolate, but something like that. I'm gonna connect it to my shader as my code 0, and I don't wanted it to cover my entire shader. I don't wanted it to be a film layer on top of it. I actually want some parts to be visible and some parts not to be visible. So I'm going to go ahead and create a procedural texture to do that. I'm going to use a solid fractal, bring it here, and just quickly adjust these values, something like that. And just, I'm going to connect it and see what happens. Blend amount 0, re-render. Okay, so we're obviously getting a lot of white. A first step to do that would be to invert this value without touching too much these values. Sometimes it can be very frustrating trying to adjust a procedural, but just by inverting, maybe we'll get something that looks better. Instead of using a reverse node, I'm going to use a remap node, because the remap not only allows me to invert a value, but then if I want to color correct it, give it or take away more contrast, I can always use the same node without having to add a new node. So I'm going to break this connection, and I'm going to connect any of my out color outputs to my input value, and then connect my out value to blend amount RGB. Okay, that's good enough. So what we're going to do here is that I'm going to open my graph, and the first thing I'm going to do is just invert these values. Just switching this graph is the same as using a reverse node. Render and see how it looks. Okay, it looks a little bit better, but we still have a lot of that chocolate. I want to use a lot less than that. So I'm going to adjust this curve. This is almost like an extreme gamma correction, or just like a gamma correction. I'm just going to use a custom gamma correction. And this is the same as the curves effect on Photoshop or something like that. Let's see how that looks. That's actually looking a lot better. I just want tiny pieces of this lighter shader floating inside our SSS. We can always come, I'm going to stop here, select this shader and make this a tiny bit darker, maybe 12.5. Re-render it, see how it looks. It's still going to look lighter because we're not getting light trapped or scattered inside our geometry. It's just being diffusely reflected, if you might. But this is looking a lot better. I like the result of this. Before we continue, I want to clean a tiny bit some of these speculars. So just to see where this noise is coming from, I'm going to come to my render elements, delete the ones I have, and I want to bring my reflection, my specular, and my SSS. There we go. Re-render, and now when you look at the render elements separately, you can see which one has noise, so then you know which samples you need to raise up or which subdivisions you need to raise. So let's look at your reflection. There's a little bit of noise, but not too much. I'm not really going to worry about the base material. Specular, we have a little bit of noise here, but not much. And SSS, it's actually not that noisy, so most likely, anyways, most likely that noise is coming from one of my lights. I'm not going to worry about my lights. I just want to make sure my shaders are working correctly. The last layer I want to add is I want to add like a glossy film coat on top of it. So I'm going to create a new Vero material. I'm going to call this grease or something like that. I just want like an oily film on top of it. I'm going to bring my diffuse color to black, and I want my reflection to be white and be a little bit glossy, maybe 0.85. And then we're going to use what we've always done, a sampler info, a reverse node, plug it in, phasing ratio to any of my inputs, and then a remap so we can control that Fresnel curve. So my output X to my input value, and then I can connect this to my reflection amount, add value to reflection color amount, draw some kind of Fresnel curve, something like that. Maybe raise this first value a tiny bit so we have some front face reflection. Okay, I think that looks good. Now we need to plug it in as my code 01 and re-render. I'm going to bring this back to my RGB. Okay, so we're getting a lot of that film code contribution and we're losing a lot of our SSS. To change that, I can always just come and change this blend amount to a lower value, like maybe 0.1. In real life, it would be better if we actually use some kind of curve that starts at 0.1 and then at the edges it goes higher. But for this example, a value of 0.1 should do the trick. Okay, that's better. We're bringing back that SSS effect. That's looking a lot better. We should have a little bit more reflection. We should have a little bit more speculars on top of those ones. Yes, there we go. And we have our SSS, which is working really nice. These black dots are actually the diffuse from the crumbs shader. So that's actually looking really nice. I like the color of that. The only thing missing is maybe some kind of bump. And instead of using it on every single shader, I'm just going to use some bump on my last like greasy layer. So with this selected, I could just always come and see what happens if I add this as my bump. But I know I'm just going to want a tiny bit of bump, so maybe like a value of 0.01. See if that makes any difference. It brought a little bit of difference. Let's try to clean our image a tiny bit before we end this lesson. So I'm going to bring this samples app, I don't know, maybe 64. We don't really need to touch this sample since this has no glossiness of any kind. And here we can bring this to, I don't know, 128 since we're using such a low glossy value. Our SSS with 64 should be a lot better. Let's see what this looks like. I'm going to pause while it renders. Okay, so you can see here it's looking a lot better. I really like the result of this. We can even increase the bump a tiny bit or maybe add some bump to the SSS as well. But now you get the basic understanding of how to build some kind of this thick liquid material where we have some kind of refractive effect on the edges. We also have some light scattering in some parts, then we can add some diffuse elements floating around and then some kind of like greasy layer on top of it. So we're going to stop in this video here, and from now on, all the few lessons that we have left, we will be working on a final scene.